Boardroom Bound, Episode 102, Driving Change Through Innovation and Advocacy in the Boardroom with Ann Cairns.
And the thing about being an executive in the C-suite of a company is you're very much involved in the day-to-day decisions of the company, how it operationally runs, the people decisions. But when you think about becoming a board member, that's not how you operate. You're much more in an overseer role. You're trying to ask good and intelligent questions about that to help guide the company in the right direction.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Ann Cairns, and she is the Executive Vice Chair at Mastercard, which is a pretty darn senior role. In addition to that, she's a very experienced board member, for example, being on the board of AstraZeneca. And in addition to that, she's had several other board experiences, including being the Global Chair for the 30% Club. And the 30% Club is moving the needle for diversity, not just in the boardroom, but also in the C-suite, which means Ann is talking to all of the movers and the shakers in the business industry. So we are going to hear from her on her perspective on her career trajectory, what it's like being in a boardroom, but also the conversations that she's having with other people who are CEOs and board chairs. Let's jump into the show. Ann Cairns, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's wonderful to be here.
And with the advent of technology, it is as if we were in the room today, even if we're halfway across the world. And delighted to have you on the show today and to hear all about the great work that you guys are doing with the 30% Club and really working in both the board and the C-suite levels to make all that happen. But before we can get to that part of it, I think our audience really needs to understand the C-suite experience that you bring in your career story to get to that point where you can have those conversations with your peers and you really understand both of those sorts of levels of how it's going across. So maybe you can just start by walking us a bit through some of your career trajectory.
Yes, very happy to. Well, I started my career many years ago, over 40 years ago, actually, as a research scientist working in the oil and gas industry. And I had the honor of being actually the first woman ever to go on the rigs in Britain, in the North Sea and the Irish Sea. So that was a lot of fun. But in my 30s, the industry was actually privatizing, and I realized that many people who were climbing to the top of the company had finance backgrounds. And at that stage, Citibank advertised in the paper for people who had experience managing people. They wanted to bring us in as mid-career hires. And so I became a banker. And I had many years as a banker, actually, 15 wonderful years with Citi and over 6 years with the big Dutch bank, ABN AMRO, and traveled all over the world and made it to the operating committee of ABN AMRO as the CEO of the payments business there. And then, of course, 2008 struck and I left banking. And I joined a big private restructuring firm, Alvarez & Marsal, just a couple of months before Lehman collapsed. And so I found myself being the CEO of Lehman for the holding company during Chapter 11, which was a really interesting job. And subsequent to that...
I'm sure you're putting that mildly there when you said interesting job, Ann.
Well, yes, I probably was. But subsequent to that, I was helping Irish banks restructure, Icelandic, Spanish, and I was actually in Greece getting ready to speak to the Greek government, and Mastercard rang me and asked whether I'd like to be interviewed as the head of international, which means running everything outside America, part of the C-suite. And of course, what a wonderful opportunity that was. So I absolutely jumped at it. And that's how I ended up being part of the Mastercard C-suite, which is where I've been for the last 9 years.
And that is
So quite a few. Sorry,
no, I was just going to say quite a storied career that we went through in about 2 minutes, but incredible experience and background. Some, I'm sure, very good stories around the water cooler, or perhaps at the bar. And we even glossed over big parts there. So during all of that, right? So you were a non-executive director and net at AstraZeneca too, which I would also say is a pretty massive and important experience.
Yes, I was very lucky to become a NED at AstraZeneca, I felt, because I knew that I wanted to be a board level on a FTSE 100 company, and actually two companies offered me that role at the same time in 2014. And I decided to join AstraZeneca, and immediately after that, Pfizer came in and attempted a hostile takeover. Now, I say I was lucky. It's rather like my commentary about Lehman Brothers, but I learned so much in that period because we were having board meetings, so regularly every few days for months while we went through that process. And it was a steep learning curve, but it was a wonderful learning curve because I really got to understand the company very quickly and what the potential of the company was. And it had great potential. And of course, we see it today working with Oxford University on the COVID vaccine.
Mm-hmm. And this will be a very interesting point in your story because with the experience you have being in the C-suite and being a NED on a FTSE 100 board, in some ways you could have written your ticket, right? So for many people listening to this show now, they are very much focused on their boards. Many of them would love to be a professional portfolio board career member. You had that opportunity at this point and you didn't go in that direction. So maybe you can talk us through, I'm sure there was some thought process where you considered it.
Absolutely. Well, I guess the key reason was I absolutely loved my day job at Mastercard. I mean, I was running all of the customer-facing activities across over 200 countries in the world, traveling up to 44 weeks a year, meeting senior representatives of government and industry in some of the biggest countries in the world. And it was an incredibly stimulating role. And Mastercard, of course, was a growth industry. I mean, the shift to digital has been phenomenal over the last 10 years. And so I didn't really want to give up that role. And as an executive of Mastercard, I was allowed to take on one other major board. And I actually thought to myself, it would be great to do something in a completely different industry so that I could learn a lot. I could really expand myself. But I definitely didn't want to step out and go into a portfolio role. I was having too much fun being an executive.
Well, that's great experience. Now, at this point, though, after AstraZeneca, you did take on several other prominent board opportunities, of which you are all the chair, I believe. And maybe you can talk us through maybe how those came up in your thought process, because I'm sure there were many organizations vying for the limited time, the free time you had to spend on those sorts of activities.
Well, yes, almost 3 years into AstraZeneca, I was approached by a very interesting company called ICE, who actually own the New York Stock Exchange. And I met the founder of ICE, a guy called Jeff Sprecher, a wonderful entrepreneur who's grown that company from nothing to be such a powerful company now and they own clearing houses all over the world and exchanges and so on. So it's very much in the financial space. And they were looking for a chair who would actually chair one of their biggest clearing houses in the world, which is ICE Clear Europe, that trades oil and credit derivative swaps and kind of sits in a very central position in the part of London City. And I thought that was so exciting because, it linked me back into the wholesale area of the business. Their clients are typically the biggest banks in the world. And of course, dealing with these things like oil trading that kind of harked back a little bit to my roots. And the idea of being a chair, I thought was a very attractive proposition. I hadn't been that before, and obviously, again, I was on another learning curve, but I enjoyed that very much, and I'm still doing that today. And of course, one of the great things is that I've recently got a new CEO this year in 2020, and she's a wonderful person, a woman, half Italian, half Dutch, a PhD in mathematics, who had actually run the U.S. clearinghouses for ICE. And I'm really enjoying working with her in that sort of chair CEO role, which is a very sort of trusted role. It's a role where, you know, you're helping the CEO, but at the same time, you're stepping back and allowing her to do her job as the executive. But, you know, you're there to steer, you're there to support, you're there to mentor. And I love all of these things.
Well, Ann, let me jump ahead for a second. I want to come back and talk about being a chair, but since you've gone to this spot now where, and to some extent, this is sort of the dream scenario where you have an amazingly qualified female in the board chair role and an amazing qualified female in the CEO role. And I guess when I think about a lot of the work that you're doing to promote more diversity in the boardroom, and that's more than just gender, and we could talk about all of that, sort of socioeconomic background, et cetera, but this is a great example of what you're trying to work for. I'm sure that must feel wonderful to be able to say, like, and I've seen what it looks like, and here's some of the benefits. How does that play out for you?
Yes, I think it absolutely makes me feel good that I'm in a position that I can actually say that. And of course, I've got other members of my board. I've got some splendid members, male members of my board, but I also have female members of my board. And roughly as a board, we're about 40% female. So I think the 30% club would feel happy about that. I certainly do. And I think, you know, you always go for the right person for the job. You choose the best person for the job. But the way that you get a more diverse set of candidates is exactly that. When you go to headhunters, you request that, you demand that actually, and it's important that you get that tipping point going of having that more than 30% threshold, because I think once you're there, the feeling about, you know, heading towards parity and the kind of conversations that you have in the boardroom and outside, you just get a lot of camaraderie going, you get a lot of deep thinking, you get people with different points of view that can actually, you know, talk about setting aspirational goals for the business. And it's just a really great culture change right from the top.
I guess the way that I've thought about it is 30% club. It's probably about a tipping point, right? And I've heard many female board members talk to me the difference of when they're the first and only female member versus when there are two, whether they were the first or the second versus when there's three and beyond. And I think it gets to what you're saying. You see different attitudes, different approaches, different cultures, different mindsets, which of course is a big part of diversity in the boardroom, because you're striving to have that critical mass where different voices and experiences and perspectives are there so you can achieve innovation. Absolutely. And I think it is a tipping point. In fact, I say, you know, in finance jargon, it's a floor. You know, it's not a cap. It's not the upper limit. It's the minimum threshold that, you know, we encourage companies to achieve, because we do think that, you know, it changes the conversation. And it's very interesting for me in the 30% club to see this, because in Britain we've already achieved that on average in the FTSE 350, whereas a couple of years ago we launched the programs in Japan, and Japan at that stage was only 7% women on boards. And in 2 years they've moved to 13%, which is, you know, really quite a big percentage shift. And the Japanese being very, perfectionist about things they do and wanting to be successful, before they even launched the club there, they actually had, you know, encouraged 45 members. And remember, the members are chairs or CEOs. They'd encouraged them to join. So they were kind of setting themselves up for success. I love that, thinking and planning ahead and setting yourself up. It's interesting, around the world, there's so many differences, right? For example, in Scandinavia, much higher. U.S., depending on the indices you look at, closer to about 20%. But we are seeing clearly progress across different countries at different paces, but in general, we are seeing progress as it goes forward. But you are involved in a couple of activities I would say are probably helping move this. So, for example, I think the next board you joined probably ties in pretty well, the Financial Alliance for Women, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I joined that as an ordinary board member, and then within a year of that, I became the chair. I think we're kind of getting the theme here that I like these chair roles, right?
Well, we've got one more to go, too, right?
Financial Alliance for Women was founded about 10 years ago with the help of the World Bank, and it actually is set up to think about the woman's economy. And what we're talking about there is, everything to do with women in the sense of serving them in the economy, but also how much women can contribute to the world's economy. And it operates across, again, a couple of hundred countries. It has membership, which are some of the biggest banks in the world, such as Westpac and Royal Bank of Scotland and Itaú and of course, Mastercard and AXA, the insurance company. And it really is there focused on trying to make the financial industry think about the women's market. What are we actually doing in terms of serving women around the world? And a lot of the data out there shows that women's portfolios actually perform much better than average. Women pay their loans back more quickly, and they actually do things like they borrow less money, but they use that money to help their families and fund their businesses more effectively. There's lots of data out there, and they really reinvest in their own communities as well. So what the Financial Alliance for Women does is it points out all of these things, and then it works on practical products and solutions and runs training programs all over the world and shares ideas. It's really powerful.
I know some of the, say, microfinance program data that I've seen is incredible about how women can be so successful as business people, then pay it into the community, which grows and just develops and magnifies, which is exciting. And Ann, let me come back to a point you just made here subtly. You were talking about how much you enjoyed being a chair. And I would love if you could help our audience understand a bit. There's a big jump from the C-suite into the NED role, from being a board director, and another jump from the board director to the chair, right? So they talk about when you go from the C-suite into the boardroom, it's nose in, fingers out, right? You're not in the day-to-day management. You have to know where the line is between what management does and what your role as a board member. And then moving into the chair role is different again, too. I wondered if you could give your perspective on these three different positions.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I told you I absolutely love my day job. And the thing about being an executive in the C-suite of a company is you're very much involved in the day-to-day decisions of the company, how it operationally runs, the people decisions. I actually love the people side of it, by the way. I manage through people rather than through numbers myself, even though I'm a mathematician. But it's when you think about becoming a board member, that's not how you operate. You're much more in an overseer role. I mean, you're looking at how the company's running. You're trying to ask good and intelligent questions about that to help guide the company in the right direction. And that's a very different role, and one where you have to listen a lot in order to be able to add value and ask the right questions. And one of the things that you do as a board member is, of course, you look at the overall strategy of the company in relation to the markets, where it is versus the competition, what's happening, in the next 5-10 years for the company, depending on the timelines that company would operate under. And as the chair, that becomes even more important because you're actually then working with the executive and the board to actually set up a governance structure which not just helps the companies in terms of their committees and so on, but allows that strategic conversation to flow. And I know in our Mastercard, which I've actually attended for many years, unlike many other boards that have strategy days for example, at Mastercard, a piece of the strategy is kind of discussed in every board meeting, which I think is a pretty effective way of doing it.
Interesting. Well, clearly the board role agrees with you, and I'm sure that ties in with the last organization we'll talk about today for your board stuff, and one we'll do a very big deep dive into, the 30% Club. And I know this is about 10 years old, so a great anniversary milestone that Dame Helen Morrissey started way back when. And you were just talking about sort of the numbers from Japan and how it went. And I remember way back when, 10 years ago, if we can think about that in the UK, before you got to the 30%, it was probably closer to about 10 to 12. So big jumps within a decade. What was it that attracted you to the opportunity to be pouring into this organization, and what's it been like in your last about a year or two since you've been with them?
Yes, well, first of all, I feel pretty passionate that, that actually women all over the world aren't actually taking their place in the global economy. And I think that it's got to start at the top of big companies that the change has to come. So the 30% Club was just a natural thing for me to want to do. And so I was actually thrilled when I was approached to say, would you be chair? And at the beginning, I actually co-chaired with my predecessor, Brenda Trinoden, and then took over, as sole chair. And what I found is, first of all, the members of the 30% Club, as I mentioned, are chairs and CEOs of some of the biggest companies in the world. So the membership are predominantly men. I love that because I've been in so many meetings and so many organizations where there's women talking to women about how things need to change. And that, the 30% Club is not like that. The 30% Club is predominantly men because men are in those positions of power. And there's about 1,200 members on a global basis. About 230 of them are chairs of big companies, and the other 970 are CEOs of big companies. And in some cases, in the case of my company, both the chair and the CEO are members of the 30% Club. And the conversations that you have are very interesting. I actually host meetings on Zoom now, although it used to be breakfast meetings or cocktails, with CEOs that are from different industries and get them together to talk about the big issues that we're facing today. And in these conversations, in the most recent ones, we've talked about COVID, of course, how everyone's managing through COVID. We've talked about Black Lives Matter, how that's impacting everyone. And the great thing is the CEOs talk to each other in a very safe environment because things don't get reported out of these meetings. They just enjoy the exchange. And of course, we talk about the diversity inclusion agenda. And one of the things that I've done in Britain lately was launch new goals for the 30% Club, where we've actually added ethnicity in there and said we'd like at least one person of colour on every FTSE 350 board. But by the way, we are the 30% Club, so we take a gender lens on things, and we'd like half of those seats to go to women of colour. And that, was really welcomed by the CEOs and the chairs in Britain. Now, we haven't done that in every part of the world yet because things are different depending on which country you're in. But it's something that, I hope that we address in terms of moving to wider diversity everywhere that we operate around the world, which is right now in about 14 countries, although I have an aspiration that we should be in all G20 countries.
Well, good goals that you have there, and clearly moving in the right direction, right? Having opportunities for all the right people to be in there. But I wonder, maybe not just 30% Club, but the other organizations you're involved with, when I look back on, say, the American situation, moving towards more diversity in the boardroom, the knock, at least originally, and perhaps still by some people now, is, well, I can't find the qualified people that I'd like to put in those seats that you're telling me, and I should have an aspiration to get to. I don't know if you've experienced that and how you tend to respond to that.
Well, first of all, I actually honestly believe there are more qualified people out there than we're all prepared to admit. But, having said that, I do think that it's very incumbent on the company to start building pipelines as well. And I think that when it comes to gender, most companies are already there in their minds about, they start recruiting at 50-50, but at some stage, and it's often at the first rung of the management level when women are in their 30s, that they start to fall behind the men, and that creates a funnel that narrows towards the top. And in my own company, Mastercard, we recognize that, and we've just rolled out a global mentorship program across, 800 women at this level in the company. I mean, the other thing that you need to do is you need to look at your succession plans and really ask yourself whether you have diverse slates of candidates on those succession plans, and whether you're actually moving towards having balanced slates when you're replacing people in jobs, because all of these things influence what happens. One of the other things that we looked at was paternity and maternity leave, and we decided, and I was so thrilled about this, that we would offer 4 months maternity and paternity leave everywhere in the world. And
Wow.
of course, the same for single-sex couples. Now, I mean, when I actually went to Japan to talk to the Mastercard people there, I was, I was slated to talk to them about, diversity and inclusion. And I stood up and I looked around the audience and I saw a lot of young men sitting in front of me. And I looked at them and said, you're going to be fathers soon if you're not already. And our company has 4 months paid leave for paternity. And I would love it if you all took that leave, because it's good for you, it's good for the company, and it's good for your family. And they all sat looking at me, completely shocked that I opened the diversity and inclusion talk in this way, But it's a powerful thing. It levels the playing field for men and women as well.
It does. I have a friend who's about to become a partner at a Big Four consulting firm, and they have a 6-month paternity leave and maternity leave option. And he had his third child after he joined the firm, and he called up the guys who were on partners and going to be on his review, and he said, am I really allowed to take this? They said, oh, yeah. He said, this isn't going to hurt me when I come up for partners. I said, oh, no, this is fine. You're good. This is okay. He said, you're sure? Yes. It's a mentality that we have to change. It's a wonderful thing you guys have that.
Yeah, and to that point, by the way, many of our guys take their paternity leave. So it's good. It means that the company culture is right. And of course, the Black Lives Matter movement has made us question ourselves about what we're actually doing, for our Black employees in America. And we've set new targets for them this year, saying that we want a 50% increase in vice presidents and above. And we've also taken $500 million and said we're earmarking this to work with Black communities across different cities in America, set up things such as making healthcare and benefit payments easier where they need to be, working with partners to do this. And also things like working with police forces on awareness training and so forth. There's lots of things we're doing in that space. And I think that companies, if they just put their mind to it, they can really make a difference, not just to communities, but to how their employees feel about them and how people feel about joining their company. I think, especially today, people want to join companies with purpose. And I think it's really needed, by the way.
And Ann, I'd appreciate your views on this, because I know the 30% Club is not just boards, it's also talking about senior management and the same sort of aspirational goals in both of those areas. And it seems to me that when I look around the world, we seem to be making, I'll call it, greater progress in the board space. And you can look at the annual report photo of the board and see how the gender difference are changing and more people of minority status getting added to boards. These are wonderful things. I don't tend to see that as often in the C-suite, and the ones in the C-suite who are the people that we're trying to get that diversity maybe don't have the same P&L's responsibilities as others, therefore perhaps not the same upward trajectory into the board space. I wonder what you're seeing in the 30% Club and whether you're taking different approaches to these two different areas.
Yeah, well, first of all, you're absolutely right. In some senses, it's easier to fix your board. And because, you can choose from people with many different backgrounds, and the boards tend to be about 10 or 12 people. And I think the other thing about it is that in Britain at least, and in many countries around the world, board members have term limits. So it's about 9 years over here. And I think that's an excellent thing because it creates natural churn. It's something that I think actually should be thought about in America. Whereas, in companies, you don't necessarily get that same natural churn, which is something that, can help introduce new people into different companies. Now, I think in terms of the C-suite, you really have to build your pipeline over a number of years. And that is much, much harder, I think, than finding qualified board members. So it's really building that pipeline through the company. And what we believe at the 30% Club is that in order to do that, you really want to find those people who will make it to that level and give them the right level of mentorship. So we created a 30% Club mentorship scheme, which is actually run by a company called Moving Ahead. And we said, let's make it cross-company. So if I put people into the mentorship scheme from Mastercard, then, those people might be mentored by people that are in the pharmaceutical industry or aerospace or whatever. There's about 2,500 people in that scheme in Britain as I speak, part of the 30% Club mentorship scheme. And some of the very senior people are actually mentored by CEOs and chairs in other companies, which is a wonderful way of networking as well. And that mentorship scheme was very focused on women, but it's now expanded to be much more inclusive than that through Mission Include, which is sort of covering the whole ethnicity, race areas and so forth. And it's gone cross-border. It's being rolled out in the States, in Mexico, in different parts of the world. So very exciting.
Well, Ann, congratulations to the great success you've had thus far in moving the direction that you want to go to. And it's been about 10 years for the 30% Club. When you sort of shift gaze from talking about the successes backwards to looking to the future and where you want to go and the goals and the way you'll get there, any thoughts about the future of the boardroom?
Well, look, I would love to see the boardroom sort of really head for parity. I was at Davos earlier this year, and the World Economic Forum said at current course and speed, women would take 257 years to reach parity with men economically. And, that's like telling somebody in the American Civil War that it's going to be okay today. Just to show the absurdity of that number. So, I really do believe that you can get change when very powerful people set aspirational goals. And I think when I've talked to the CEOs and chairs, they all sort of say now, of course, 10 years later, well, the women's thing is obvious. And now they're just realizing that there's many other aspects they need to think about, whether it's race and ethnicity, whether it's disability. But the thing is that nobody's pushing back on it. Everybody's saying, yes, we must do this. And cognitive diversity in our companies is important. And so I'm an optimist because I think that if the people in charge actually think that, then the world will change. And I don't think that it should take 257 years. I don't even think it should take 25. I hope it's going to happen in my lifetime.
I was going to say, I hope it's not even 10% of that. I agree with you. Well, and we're very excited about the progress that you're making, and thank you for sharing all the great results and the successes that you're having. We were delighted to have you on the show today. We appreciate you sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the conversation. It seems to have gone really quick. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Ann Cairns. This is clearly someone who loves what she does. Not only her day job as executive vice chair at Mastercard, but clearly the board chair role that she's in for several organizations, including the 30% Club. And it's fascinating to think about the conversation she is having with sitting board chairs and CEOs, talking about how they bring more diversity into the boardroom, which is clearly top of mind for so many organizations. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to all of today's resources. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land aboard sea. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. And thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.